I'm Martha Pellegrino with Brava LLC, and I'm so excited to be an out boss.
Hello, Out Bosses. Rhodes Perry here, and welcome to this week's episode of The Out Entrepreneur, a weekly podcast where I get to interview today's most inspiring LGBTQ bosses crushing it in business. And on this week's episode, I am super excited to be welcoming Martha Pellegrino, who is joining us here in our Portland studios live, which I always love. So welcome, Martha.
Hey, thanks so much, Rhodes.
Yeah. Are you ready to inspire fellow Out Bosses?
I'm so excited. Let's do this.
Okay, we're going to do it. All right. So just a little bit about Martha before we jump into the interview. So Martha is the founder and chief Bravissima. Did I say that right?
You did.
Okay, awesome. Officer of Brava LLC, which is a company that helps clients navigate the complex world of public affairs and organizational change. That's big stuff. So Martha specializes in accelerating strategic outcomes, advancing equity, and creating effective teams. Prior to starting her own company, Martha served as the director of government relations for the city of Portland, basically the city's lobbyist, right?
That's right.
That's awesome. Okay. She oversaw state, federal, and international affairs. She has a lot of different degrees, and maybe we will talk about them on the show, so I won't go through everything, but she's super smart. And she and her wife, Alisa, live in Southeast Portland with their two really cute cats. So and you can see them on Instagram if you want.
Yeah, they're famous on
Awesome.
Instagram. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. All right. So with all of that intro, Martha, why don't you tell us in your own words a little bit more about your business and what makes it unique?
Well, thanks so much, Rhodes, and thanks again for having me. I'm so excited to really be able to speak to what it's like to start my own consulting business. And that's something I did about 2.5 years ago. And at the heart of it, I help clients solve problems. I do a lot of listening. I tend to work on helping guide clients through strategic communications and strategic planning, but also very much with this idea and this focus toward teams. And how do you get teams to work more effectively together? A lot of times executives will say, I've got this really big, complicated project, and this is the group I have working on it. And I always start with, what is it you're trying to achieve? And I try to make sure that you've got the right people set up in the right way to get to the right outcome. And that's something that within an organization you can't always see really clearly, but it's a way that I like to help clients through that process. So even though the projects are really diverse, that I think problem solving and then communications are really at the heart of almost everything I do.
Okay, so when you're asking your clients, what is it that you're trying to solve? What's the percentage of clients actually being able to describe that to you pretty succinctly?
Oh, gosh, it really just varies on a project. So it could be, and some things are more straightforward than others. I mean, this whole world of organizational change, which is a world you know well, is it's a little harder pinned down. But a client might say, hey, I need to achieve this very concrete outcome, and we've got a year to do it, and the board expects this to happen. It's a little bit easier to help track that change. But sometimes those issues are a little bit, even when you're working in the issues in the area of diversity, equity, inclusion, there isn't that necessarily concrete outcomes in the same way. So it just really depends on the project.
Yeah. So a couple of things that you were saying, just kind of when you're talking about your business. One, you got started in your consulting firm a couple of years ago, right? So take us back to the origin story of your business, which I think is pretty great. Kind of specifically what was going on from the time that you left working at the city, in a really prestigious job, right? And making that tough decision that so many of our listeners have made, or some folks are still kind of grappling with, when do I take that leap? And what does it look like? So kind of take us through that moment, and what was your why in terms of getting started?
Yeah, I think leaving your dream job to start your own business is probably, I found it to be one of the hardest things I've ever done. And I had the opportunity to work in an extremely kind of high impact, high performing area. And I worked under 3 mayors of Portland, and it was just such a privilege to have that position. But when I decided, I'd worked in that area for 11 years, and I had to either tell myself I was going to die doing that work, or I was going to try to step out and do something really creative of my own. And my process was I made a list of 4 things. The first that I could possibly do, the first was to keep doing what I'm doing, and then a couple other jobs that were already established that I could see myself moving into. And then the fourth was the highest risk option, which was start my own business. And I probably spent 3 to 4 months digging into, okay, what's the best option for me? And at the end of the day, I chose option 4, which is to start my own company. And for my origin, it was really challenging since I was a public official. I couldn't have an overlap. So I had to take both feet and jump. I couldn't develop clients. I couldn't develop a business while I had a high profile position. And my wife and I had a lot of conversations, and I basically just decided to save up 6 months where I wasn't going to need a paycheck and just know that I was going to quit my job and not necessarily have another income there for that time. So that was part of it.
Talk us through that a little bit, because I know that there are some folks who are tuning in who are in public service now and kind of have those similar restrictions. So, there's this kind of 6-month buffer point. I know from my own experience of working in government, it was actually like 2 years before even talking to where I came from. Like, what were your restrictions? And then, in those 6 months that you kind of built up, some savings, what were you doing to kind of plan for the growth of the business? So I know that there are 2 questions and maybe a little bit more, but take it where you want to go.
I think for anyone who's worked in the public sector, you want to make sure that you are upholding the ethics and the integrity of those institutions and of those governments. And so in my case, there was a 2-year revolving door before I could do, I would say, very limited communications with the city of Portland. And in my case, I wasn't allowed to lobby the mayor or, a couple other people in City Hall. But I think I've always decided that I take a much broader view of that. So I had just decided that I wasn't going to do that for 2 years and go back to City Hall with any kind of communications projects. Yeah. But, what did I do during that time? I really just let myself, first of all, it's like once you leave a big job, there is a period of decompression. And I just let myself have some time. I mean, I did a lot of walking, a lot of gardening, a lot of things that rather than showing up at your job and working 12 to 14 hours a day, and just kind of really being much more intentional about what I wanted to do. And what I wanted my business to do was not a reflection of what I had been doing the last 11 years, and start getting really selective about the type of work that I wanted to do going forward. So I did a lot of brain clearing to create the space to make that happen.
Okay, that is great guidance because we've often talked with guests around making the leap and what you're doing to prepare as you get there. And some people start the side hustle. You had limitations of like, I can't really do that with the limitations of this very high profile job. Walk us through how you reintroduced yourself to the world, right? Because for 11 years, you're seen as this kind of major power player in Portland. You're very affiliated with government and just kind of liaising between probably Portland and Salem and DC. And so what was your process with that? Was it difficult to kind of say, whoa, I'm like the CEO of Brava Point? And, when did it kind of finally stick that like this is the thing that you're doing and it felt kind of more real than kind of playing CEO on TV?
I think the very first thing is that I got to choose what I worked on. And any of you who've ever worked for someone else where they kind of tell you what they want you to do or what the projects are and the outcomes are, I remember seeing this meme that stuck with me, which is, if it's not a hell yes, it's a no. So my screen for whether or not I was going to do something, and it wasn't, I could do that. I know I have the skills to do that. I know I could help a client with that. It was, if it's not a hell yes, it's a no. So even early on, before I had a stable revenue stream coming into the business, I said no to a lot of projects because they weren't reflective of the work I wanted to be doing and be known for. And the way I started communicating with people who knew me in a much more high impact political role was, how many times have you seen projects go wrong because they weren't set up initially correctly? And I really thought about bringing my business upstream. So that's where I started working with executives on what's the strategy, what's the team long before it ever hit the political world and the political decision makers, because time and time and time again, we could point to projects that failed or required so many more resources to get done had they just started the correct way at that time. So when I thought, what value can I add to a client, is I can save them a lot of money by starting well on an idea early on, be brought on to help shape that structure before it ever needs to go before decision makers.
Yes, and that is so, so needed. And I think kind of with the gravitas that you bring to your business, right? I mean, prudent CEOs, prudent executive director, whoever your client is, whoever's kind of at the top of that would be wise to kind of listen to your advice of like, hey, I know some things. I've seen a lot of things that have gone sideways because people weren't intentional. And I think that goes back to the intentionality of how you started your business, of just kind of creating that brain space to just figure out, okay, what am I doing and what do I want to do? And I love that if it's not a hell yes, it's a no. For folks that are listening, if you're getting started, sometimes you do have to say yes to things just to kind of get cash flow. We had a guest on the show before, cash flow is queen. We've learned that on the show. Eventually you do get to a point where you're busy, and you do start to get that luxury of like, no, this is not in alignment with where I want to go. So I think that's really, really good advice. So like in the world of public affairs and change management, keeping in mind that most of the listeners are LGBTQ entrepreneurs, right? What's one thing that you think that our audience probably doesn't know about this world that might be helpful for them to know or that they ought to know? And maybe more in particular with change management than, I don't know. I mean, public affairs, you can go in probably a number of directions.
I was going to say, one thing I will notice, I've noticed is how much politics has changed in the last 15 years, and the who's in charge and who are the decision makers is changing in a way that if I were to go back in a time machine 15 years ago as a young lesbian doing this work, it was not like this. And in fact, the first time I walked in the state capitol in Oregon this session, I saw so many queer people. I thought, where did all of these wonderful, beautiful people come from? And in fact, they started a queer caucus. And so one of the first things I got to do as a business owner is I bought pizza for the queer caucus because and it was a really, for me, as opposed to thinking, oh, okay, well, this is a place I now need to keep, I just think, oh my gosh, the next generation of queer people are taking over. And when I think about political systems, I think about racial justice. I think about LGBTQ justice. And those are the things that are important to me to see. And so because our elected leadership is changing and the diversity of our elected leadership is changing, we're seeing different people running the political process. So I have to say it's one of the highlights of my year is just noticing those changes and how power then is being redistributed in communities that have not had power. I think on the organizational change side, it's interesting that even just the concept of diversity when it comes to LGBTQ people, I wish I could say that I've seen more change there, and I've seen sort of some progress, and I've seen some backsliding, because I was one of 26 directors at the city of Portland, and when I left, I was the only LGBTQ director. And I have to say, in a city that is known nationally and internationally for being a progressive city, that is something that I just think we need to be more mindful about, and that we need to work harder as institutions to understand that we can't be what we can't see. And we need to make sure that we have government leaders who are reflective of the communities in which we work. So, yeah.
Yes. So it's kind of like this double-edged sword, right? So you're going to Salem, you're seeing a queer caucus, which is amazing, and like queer folks from different racial backgrounds, it sounds like. Yeah. And just, it's a reflection of the future in terms of how demographics are shifting in this country, and actually having access, getting these jobs and being staffers for elected officials. And then kind of at the same time, it's still kind of that challenge of kind of getting higher up, like whether you're an elected official or a director, at the city level, in a really progressive place. I mean, there's still obviously work to be done. But I think to your credit, being in that position in the city for so long, you were someone that probably many of those staff who are now in Salem, they saw you, and, they saw it, they can be it, and they're on the path, so that, that gives me some hope, in our current political environment, where I'm like, oh, that's a good spin. I like that. So we'll go with that. And there's still work to be done. Equity is really important to you. You're building a business, you're CEO, you're creating jobs, you might be subcontracting out, et cetera. What's one thing that you're doing in your business now, or practices that you're starting to adopt to really extend economic opportunities to marginalized communities, including LGBT folks? Like, I'm sure that's a part of your thinking. Like, what might be one example just for other listeners around kind of thinking about how can I be more inclusive in my own business because I can be that change?
Absolutely. I decided to be a solopreneur and not scale and not build a big consulting firm or not build a big lobbying firm. And all of that was really intentional. So then I had to ask myself, what's the buying power of my business and how can I realize my business's values through that? So I made a decision kind of from the start that I was going to support female entrepreneurs, LGBTQ entrepreneurs, and people of color and Native entrepreneurs and have that be a part of my basically my supply chain. So when I needed to hire a designer, to design my logo, I hired a woman who was 7 months pregnant, and it was an 8-week project. So you do the math, but she did an amazing job. She was on a timeline, and I was on a timeline. But
she's going to get it done.
She got it done before the baby came. And I don't think a lot of people can say, oh, there was that time I hired this woman who was very pregnant to do this project. But it turned out to be incredible. But everything from the stores where I shop and where I try to purchase things I need for the business. So it's just a very intentional way of showing my values as an out entrepreneur and supporting the communities I want to see be successful.
Yeah. I think kind of thinking about the things that you need to outsource and being really intentional of where you go rather than like, oh, my friend down, just really thinking about how you can be a game changer of giving that one project to someone who could really, really benefit from it. And I love how intentional you are about that. There's a common thread going through this interview of intentionality. So I really appreciate that. Kind of last question on just kind of talking solely about your business. And that is, right now, what's the one thing that has you lit up? Like, what's making your heart sing about business these days?
Oh, my goodness. I feel like I'm hoping that I want this to be a summer of writing. I've really kind of been in the midst of some big and complicated projects, and I see this wonderful kind of daylight on the horizon where I want to get back to writing and publishing on LinkedIn and taking these kind of ideas and sharing them out with the rest of the world. And it's so hard to get to that part where you're writing when you're in the midst of really big, complicated projects. So
yes.
I'm looking forward to a summer of clarity and putting some more kind of cool pieces out there that for other folks to kind of comment on and keep that ecosystem we have going.
Yeah. That's always, just being really intentional also about carving out that creative time. So whether it's like a month, a season, if it's impossible for some listeners thinking right now, like, I have no time, there's not enough hours in the day, like really, I encourage you and challenge you, even 15, 20 minutes, like some kind of time block in the morning or whenever you're most creative. The mornings are my creative time, but just show up and start writing and see what comes out. Or, if you're not a writer, talk into a microphone and record it, talking to your phone. There could be some really amazing work that comes out of that. And who knows, it could be your next great business idea. So I think that's really inspiring, and hopefully it motivates other people to be creative as well. Okay, so we're going to jump to a quick sponsorship break, and when we come back, we're going to continue our interview with Martha. Hey, Outbosses, Rhodes Perry here. As you all know, part of my passion for this podcast is to empower you and fellow LGBT entrepreneurs to cultivate a feeling of purpose and belonging in your business. To know that you can show up and be the most authentic version of yourself. Purpose, belonging, and workplace culture are concepts I take seriously in my own consulting business. In fact, I'm on a mission to empower leaders just like you and those on their way to joining us to cultivate cultures of belonging. In my upcoming book, Belonging at Work, I share some of my personal struggles of coming out as a trans guy in the workplace and how I leverage this experience as one of my business superpowers. Now, I'm on a mission to support you in taking simple actions that will make a world of difference for anyone who has ever felt as if they needed to hide important aspects of themselves on the job. When you commit to purchasing a special, limited edition copy of the book, a portion of your purchase will support expanding workplace opportunities for fellow transgender and non-binary people. An added bonus, your story about what it means to belong at work will be featured on the book's website to inspire others. You're ready to belong at work now. To learn more, visit rhodesonamazon.com or text 444-999 and type the word belong. Again, that's rhodesonamazon.com or text 444-999 and type belong. So, Martha, we're jumping back into the interview, and this is the fun part. This is where we get to talk about our rainbow family. And this is probably the hardest question of the interview, but I think it's one of the most important just because I think it helps our guests who are still trying to negotiate, how out can I be as a business owner? Can I even be out? Or if they're still working for someone else, negotiating that challenge of coming out again and again. So with all of that, I'm curious for you, just kind of thinking about the time when you were an employee working for someone else, or even in your business working with some clients. Has there ever been a moment that's been difficult for you to just kind of show up 100%? Talking about Alisa, talking about your partner, talking about going to Pride or whatever it might be. Was there ever a hesitation in the workplace? And if there's a specific example, which I hope there is, how did you work around it? Because I think hearing your story may inspire other people just to feel connected, like they're not the only one, but also have some good strategies around working to show up more authentically in their work.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think there's a lot of people, I'm a 40-something of the Generation X group. And when I started in the workplace, I'm not sure it was really all that safe to be out in a lot of environments. It turned out, though, I was working at a community college, and my boss kind of just pulled me into her office and just told me it was okay. I was during a time I wasn't even out to my family, or I wasn't able to be out to my family.
Wow.
And so it was a really interesting path for me in that the workplace started being a bit easier for me to be out than even at home, which is kind of a bit of a flip. And partly I think I was attracted to workplaces that were a bit more open in that way. But I grew up in the Midwest in kind of a conservative town, so it was a little bit of a surprise. So I give a lot of credit to that boss I had, who just had the insight to let me be who I was at work, even if I couldn't be who I was at home.
Yeah.
So, and then I would say it's typically been pretty obvious. I walk around looking a little bit like Rachel Maddow, and I think it hasn't always been. I would say there were definitely environments I was put in situations I was put into where there were assumptions about my sexuality, that I was part of a dominant culture, and it was really uncomfortable. So yeah, I would have to say that, navigating those things as an out lesbian, it doesn't matter how much experience you have, how much life experience you have, you always have to draw on your own personal authenticity and your own personal safety about what to do in those situations. And I have to say, it hasn't happened a lot, but when it does happen, it can be really, really surprising, really disconcerting.
Yeah. So there was a lot in your response. So I just kind of want to unpack it a little bit, because I think it's really helpful. Number one, starting out your career early on at a community college, and for an ally to step up to kind of say, hey, it's cool, be you in the workplace, and kind of like giving you space to almost like be more comfortable, to be more comfortable in your skin, but testing it out in an environment separate from your family, because you weren't at that place to kind of share that with those closest to you in your family. And then also this other, just kind of like my thinking on that is like, wow, the workplace, there are challenges sometimes with being out in the workplace, but when you find a workplace like the ones that you've been gravitated towards, those that are more open, what a disruptor that can be just for you, and the positive influence that it could have. So I love that. I love that kind of flip of the story. I think you might be one of this is, I don't know, episode 120 something. You may be the first guest that has gone in that direction. And I think that's really helpful. This other piece that you were talking about of being assumed to be a part of a dominant culture. So like being assumed straight until shared otherwise, and that's like such a challenge, because I think that's something that resonates for a lot of listeners, who are probably like nodding their heads like, yes. And it's awkward. And, it's almost like, this happens for me on the gender identity side, where people are like, oh, it's just another cis guy. And it's like, okay, that's cool. Like, you're seeing me exactly how I want to be seen, like as a guy, right? But there's this awkwardness where you're trying to build a relationship and you're trying to build trust and rapport quickly. And it's actually been people within LGBT space more often than not, because I don't know, maybe more candid conversations, but folks would say, I was really surprised and you didn't correct me on this for a long time. And I felt, almost like I'm being lied to, like the other. And it's just like, whoa, that's not what's happening. But I could relate to that, but just in a different way. And, at what point could you ever correct the record, so to speak, or do you? And I guess it depends relationship to relationship to relationship, right? So if it's someone you're only going to do a quick project on for a couple of weeks or whatever, is it worth it to take that risk or not? And I think it always goes back to safety. So anyway, those are kind of my
and
reactions.
I do think it says something too about the workplace and power. And we know that the power dynamic is still kind of white cisgendered men still who are in positions of power still believe that everything is for them. And, being out and queer for as long as I've been, which is like almost 25 years now, it's kind of funny that I am caught off guard. I've been wearing pantsuits for 25 years, and I occasionally wear earrings and occasionally wear lipstick, but nobody else is usually mistaking me as straight. But that is the world. Those are still the decision makers. And there is still this lens that oftentimes white cisgendered men in power believe that they don't have to notice those cues.
Yeah.
So I think that's I think that's a really good thing for our community to continue to push back against. But every situation is going to be different.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And when you're safe enough to kind of push back, it does immediately. It's almost like if anyone's ever had kind of an unconscious bias training, or you know what that is. It's like almost instantly for those folks that made the assumption, it's like, whoa, and it's like, see, like now you're thinking, and just don't make assumptions, but that requires, a good deal of trust and rapport with those folks that you feel like you have enough emotional bandwidth to do that kind of work with, and I really feel like too, when you're doing that, you care enough about that person and their own evolution. But I find myself in those situations where I'm like, is this really worth it to go down the path right now or not?
Definitely.
That's super helpful. Thank you for just kind of talking a little bit more about your story there. When it comes to lived experiences, the gifts of the journey, however you want to frame being a part of the rainbow family, kind of looking back on your unique experiences, and kind of 25 years of being out. And I think the great unifier for those of us who are out is this coming out journey again and again. So from that and maybe other experiences, do you see any kind of superpower gleaned from being a part of the rainbow family that you leverage in your business, even in past jobs where you felt like you could stand out because of these lived experiences?
Yeah, I mentioned that I grew up in the Midwest. I grew up in the town of Peoria, Illinois, which was kind of average America in the 1980s. And for me, and I think a lot of these broader political dynamics we're dealing with now, is my real passion is how do you reach across difference? I can't tell you the number of times since I've been out that my goal really is to kind of understanding relationships, to get people to understand who I am as a human being and get to understand my life, understand that my life is not a threat to them. And if I were to say my superpower as an LGBT boss is really this kind of bridging urban-rural divide. After the 2016 election, I thought, gosh, if someone just wanted to pay me to work, to do focus groups and to open up communication in middle America for a year and do a cool project, I would jump at that. That was right around the time I was building a business. Yeah. And I think to myself, we need to create more open communications and help people understand. And it's a two-way direction. It's me not making assumptions about people who live in different parts of the country, who hold strong beliefs, who believe that LGBTQ people are a threat to them and their family. I've always just wanted to break through it as much as possible. So even when I worked in Portland, I spent a lot of my time traveling around the state in small communities and meeting with elected officials from smaller towns, and just to really emphasize the commonalities that we have as people and as people who want to make the world better.
Yeah. So a couple of superpowers that have come up in past interviews that I feel like this relates to is one, kind of this idea of the bridge builder. I think it speaks to both empathy, like helping kind of folks understand your own story and elements of your story of like, oh, I'm from the I was born in the Midwest. Wow, we're connected, instantly just by you sharing your story. And then maybe sharing more of your story about being part of the rainbow family. And then that opens up someone's heart or their mind in a different way than kind of the myths that may have been perpetuated wherever they're getting their maybe misinformation about LGBT communities. But like this other piece too is the translator. It goes translation to empathy, but being able for yourself to be committed enough to understand the perspective of someone who might be misinformed and being patient enough to kind of share a little bit of like, that's interesting. What makes you, getting curious about it without getting defensive
right.
or angry, which, many of us have the right to be if something has gone sideways. And microaggressions happen. But if you can hang, in that space long enough, that's really powerful. It's super powerful. And in the beginning of the interview, I didn't go through all of your education and your background, but I think it's relevant for this. So you have an MA in English and philosophy, or a BA in English and philosophy, an MA in English literature, and you're a lawyer. So you have a JD. So I mean, like those skills as well that you actually learned in the classroom, so relevant to what you just said, where, you're curious about communication. Like, what's gonna, we're speaking the same language, but we have completely different cultures, and how do we find connections there? Something that resonated for me as you were talking is like the experience of the other, being curious enough of like, okay, I felt different before from like the dominant group. And, I may see that other people are struggling from being othered for different reasons, and building community that way and coalition that way, which you didn't speak to, but I know of your work here in Portland, you're really good at building coalition in that way as well. So I think that's impressive. And do you find in that work that you get skills by working with groups that are also marginalized for different reasons to help you kind of in your own journey, kind of build those bridges with people that are important in your life?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. It's funny when I think about who my clients have been, a lot of, or at least a few of the projects I've worked on have had some kind of work that has engaged and involved marginalized communities in a way that don't normally get involved and engaged. But for me, it's really been, I sometimes feel like a lot of the people who are hiring me are kind of from that dominant culture, and I'm the person who's kind of helping them work through ways of kind of better business practice and better engagement. And it's just like, it's a great thing about being a consultant is you get to guide people through and help them accelerate what they want to get done. I will say on kind of a fun note, and this is this idea of reaching across differences. When Alisa and I were married in Portland back in 2012, before it was legal, and we rented out this big, beautiful performing arts center, and we joked that it was the big, gay, Italian, illegal bipartisan wedding, because my goal was to invite Republicans who I know would never have been to an LGBTQ wedding, and they had a blast, right? And so we even used our own wedding to create community to try to move forward the agenda, but in a really loving and inclusive way.
Yeah.
And it's just each time we just look for, and I'm sure Alisa was giving me the side look when I was working up the guest list, but I'm like, this is part of the movement. And I've had plenty of arguments with my queer friends about what the right approach is. And I'm just not one who kind of sits in one camp and throws bombs to the other camp. I'm like, let's run across the field and see what we have in common.
Yeah. I mean, that's the work of democracy, if we still believe in it. It's like, it's the consensus building that can be messy, and we can get offended. We can offend other people. I mean, that's part of the learning process, unfortunately, and trying to limit harm. I mean, I think it's remaining curious, resisting the temptation of staying within a bubble that feels safe and comfortable, right? Like, I mean, there's reasons to be in that space, to recharge and regenerate. But, if you have the energy to run across the field, as you said, it is really powerful, because I think that's where the change happens. And on the show, we talk a lot about stepping outside of your comfort zone, because the magic of learning, the magic of growing, the magic of building a business is really getting uncomfortable. And so kind of speaking to our lived experiences of being in the rainbow family, being queer, however we identify, it's like, okay, we know this feeling, so let's leverage it. And so definitely as building a business, like don't be afraid of the fear or the uncomfortable nature of when you don't know, because that's how you get closer to knowing, I guess. Or doing definitely. The work. Okay, so we've talked about both some of the challenges of being a part of the rainbow family as it shows up in the workplace, and all of the superpowers, right? So for folks tuning in, whether they are working for someone else right now, they're on the path of being an entrepreneur, they've started their own business, they're veteran business owners, wherever they are, what advice would you have for the audience just to show up to be more authentic in their own work?
It's so funny because sometimes it depends on the environment you're in, how you show up. I've always tended to be a little bit more open and a little bit less aloof than a lot of folks who kind of come out of the political world. I think a lot of what you would think of political consultants, it's a pretty stiff group. And I have always decided that I'm going to show up and be candid and be honest and be funny about challenges and call them out in a way where it may be a bit higher risk. But as a consultant, the most important thing that I can give a client is honesty. as opposed to I've pretty much declared war on jargon. I almost never use it. I try not to. I try not to reduce the work to a few words as a way to make it seem like I'm creating value. I'm very much committed to creating value every single day on a project. And even when I decide which projects to work on, I think to myself, I take a look at it and think, can I help the client do that? And if I can't do that, or I don't think it's the best thing for me, there's somebody who's better, I like telling them that right up front. I don't want anyone to spend any money on working with me or the time working with me if I can't help deliver. Yeah. So I think being honest and raw in ways that I think a lot of clients aren't used to it. And that's the value. The value is saying, we've spent 3 weeks together and here's my analysis, and these are some major things that need to change, and I'm happy to help you change them, but ultimately it's your decision. I mean, I can do that in a 3-hour meeting or after 3 weeks, but that's the value. And if you're cagey just because you want to keep getting paid by a client, you don't think they want to hear it, then that's kind of where the problems are.
Yeah.
So
that's 100% amazing advice, because it's the advantage, like in the world of consulting. I know a lot of folks who are tuning in, you may not be a consultant, but in the world of consulting, like that's what makes you stand out, I think, is just being honest and really delivering information that, especially having, for you and for myself, having been an employee, it's a completely different power dynamic when you're inside. But there's something really liberating about being on the outside of like, look, I've seen this many, many, many times, and the direction that you may be headed may not give you the result or get to that goal that you stated early on when we did kind of our exploratory, are we going to work together or not? And I have found that like working with clients in that capacity, it's almost like a cathartic feeling for them of like, oh, really? And it's kind of like, you could use me, like I can leave at any point in time, but like use the advice, and shoot it up the flagpole or share it with your board or whoever needs to get on board with you. But that's kind of the power of it. Yeah, I could see how some people might be kind of yes people.
And so I guess the practical piece of advice that fits there is I will oftentimes I'll start with a short-term contract with someone, and if it looks like it's a year-long project, I'm like, well, let's just take it in phases and let's do 3 months and let's see where we are and let's take a chance to reevaluate. And that way you don't feel like you're stuck in a situation where you can't be helpful. They don't feel like stuck in, most of the time I will say that it really isn't the client who's like, this isn't working. They're looking for something. Mm-hmm. The question is whether or not they're willing to kind of act on the work. And so it gives you that room. So I like using kind of phased contracts, if you will, just so everyone can kind of look around and have those honest moments. Yeah.
It's interesting that you said that, because I'm thinking about a conversation I had with a friend a week ago about relations, or like romantic relationships. And like, there's this idea of like a 7-year re-up of like kind of checking in of like, is this working or not? And like, no harm, no foul if it's not. But I'm like, okay, and that can apply in business and vice versa. So take that wherever you want to take it, listeners. I found that was kind of funny and interesting and also sad. But anyway, so
7 years is a long time, Rhodes.
Yes, I know. 7
years is that's a big investment of time.
Yeah, maybe.
In a personal relationship.
In a personal relationship. Yeah. So maybe with your clients, I like the 3-month kind of approach.
Good,
yeah.
Good.
Okay. Maybe just one question or two on business mindset. So this question, I've shared with other guests, and I'm curious your take on it, Martha. So when you got started in your business, and you made that transition from employee to entrepreneur, was fear present? I'd be surprised if it wasn't, but if fear was present, how did you kind of work around, the feelings of I'm not ready, or I'm not sure if this is the right path, like whatever kind of doubt popped up, how did you work around it? How do you work around it now if it does pop up? Any kind of advice for guests? Or for listeners?
Absolutely. I mean, it's super scary. When I decided to start the business, I'm like, oh, let's do the hardest thing. Let's just start my own, let's start the company and jump into the deep end of the pool, not knowing what's there. I will say that it wasn't overwhelming. It just was, okay, I'm doing this. And I was committed. The first time I got to sit down with a client, though, and, I probably must have had 10 different conversations before I landed on a project that seemed like a good project for me. And it was a completely different area, but I do see myself as a problem solver. And at the very core of it, I know how to get things done really fast, really effectively, and can help executives work through things faster than they normally would otherwise. And so I just kind of fall back on what my strengths are. I asked a lot of questions. I just started setting up really clear kind of scopes of work, really clear. All right, I just want to make sure everybody knows at every single phase of this project what's going to happen. And then when I delivered the final product on that first project and the client was like, oh, that's really good work, I was like, oh my God, okay, phew, all right, I can do this.
Yes.
Okay, because I had never produced a product like that. I had never worked on a project like that. And so even though it was terrifying, it was a new way of working. I have a saying, which is, depending on the day, like happy client, happy Friday. Like if I deliver something and the client's happy, I'm like, happy client, happy Saturday. And I used to tell that to my team, and I think my former team, and I think they continue to use that to that day. If a client is really happy with the work, it's happy client, happy Tuesday. And that's just something to be honored and celebrated.
I love that. And there's an element to what you're talking about as well, where it's just the feedback that you get when you're your own business owner, you're your own boss. Feedback is sometimes hard to get, So when you do receive that and it's positive, especially when it's positive, it's this like, yes, okay, I'm on the right track. And kind of the more that you feel that, it may kind of give you some breadcrumbs of like, yeah, you're headed in the right direction, and at least kind of early on getting started, it's like, all right, I've got this, And also like one of the things that you were saying is kind of unique when you're doing something that's project-based, seeing the goal for a client initially, kind of having the theory of change, whatever that is, and then the deliverables. And then when you start to kind of like fulfill the deliverables and you're done, it's like you have something tangible, like we did this together. And I think that might be something different when you are working with someone where sometimes it's these projects that just churn for year after year. It's like, where is this going?
Right.
So there's something fulfilling to that. All of the risk aside, there is that you get to kind of walk away, especially if it's an idea and then it manifests. I mean, that's kind of amazing. And that goes back to kind of just building a business in general. It's like you start with an idea, hopefully it's solving someone's problem, and then you're able to solve the problems and boom, you've manifested this idea from your brain, which is great.
And it is cool because how often organizations can spin on something. We've all seen it, or, we've always seen groups and they just spin on things and spin and spin and spin. And when you realize that you're the person who can walk in and be like, oh, this thing you've been churning on for quite some time, let's work together and find a path. And then 6 weeks later, they're kind of out of it. And you're like, okay, it's been great working with you. Keep going, because you really ultimately are trying to build capacity of organizations to function better. That really is satisfying because if they build on those ideas, I mean, I never want to be the kind of consultant who produces a report, the report sits on the shelf. That sounds awful. I think, there's a lot of desire to create positive impact. And once you can do that and then move on and your organization that you worked with is better for it, then that's an awesome feeling.
Yes, 100%. So with just like one last question for you, Martha, is more about your business. Like, where can we find you? I mean, you were talking about writing LinkedIn articles. So this is going to happen in the summer. We're going to manifest that right now. You're on a deadline.
I'm committed.
August 30th.
Yeah, that's
there's
right. There
out
better be some more things out there. Yeah.
So where are you online? How can we learn more about you? How can we stay connected?
Absolutely. Well, LinkedIn is a great spot. And I already have a couple articles up. One is about how to leave your dream job. So if any of you have an awesome job, and it's called Leaving Gracefully. But you can connect with me on LinkedIn at Martha Pellegrino. And then I also actually challenge the kind of why are we still going to work? So you'll have to learn more about that. But that's a LinkedIn article for those of you who are tired of getting up and going through the same routine every day, that there may be better ways that we can all work. And so I'm also on Twitter at Martha Pell. That's more of a personal account, but you'll see lots of cute pictures of cats and LGBTQ positive tweets. And so those are probably the two best ways to find me. But I'd be really excited to connect with other out entrepreneurs.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. And so it's so interesting that leaving gracefully, what you're talking about, of going from your dream job to being your own boss, we've now kind of introduced this mini-sode series. And so we've already had one out, and it was about coming up with a business idea. This next one, when we go into the studio and we record, will be about making that shift from employee to entrepreneur. So I think between this recording and when we're going to go back into the studio in a couple of hours, I need to read that.
Yeah,
So I will reference this interview.
Okay, cool.
So that's a little sneak peek for listeners. But so thank you so much for joining us. This was really great. And I think the time flew by, as it usually does, but this was really engaging. So thank you, Martha. I really appreciate it. And for Outbosses, thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode. It is always a privilege to connect with you and so many inspiring outbosses like Martha. So for details from today's conversation, please go over to our website, which is outentrepreneur.com. And if you are adverse to going onto your web browser, you can always text 444-999 and write in Outboss, and you will get all of those awesome show notes. As a next step, consider subscribing, leaving a rating and review in iTunes, and let us know how we're doing. Please leave your questions, leave your comments. If you have ideas for really inspiring guests, we are always open to receiving those. And as always, keep being your authentic selves 100% of the time.